Hello Chrysofolcia, welcome back to the channel, Old Boy here, and today we're going to be following on from the last episode in looking at Diodorus Siculus' account of the origin of the Greek letters. So last week we looked at an excerpt which said that the letters which Cadmus brought to the Greeks weren't Phoenician in origin and that they were actually first utilised by the Pelasgians and were therefore known as the Pelasgic letters. We then looked at how the term Pelasgian was applied to the Thessalians and sometimes the wider Greeks in general. The term was also applied to the Turanians, who according to some sources later became known as the Etruscans. And we're going to unpack the term Pelasgian and investigate them in more detail in another episode. But for now, we're going to be focusing on the letters today. And to get started, I just want to read out this other quote from Diodorus Siculus. The Heliadae, besides having shown themselves superior to all other men, likewise surpassed them in learning and especially in astrology. And they introduced many new practices in seamanship and established the division of the day into hours. The most highly endowed of them by nature was Tenages, who was slain by his brothers because of their envy of him. But when their treacherous acts became known, all who had a hand in the murder took to flight. Of their number, Macar came to Lesbos, and Candalus to Kos, and Ichthys, sailing off to Egypt, founded there the city men call Heliopolis, naming it after his father, and it was from him that the Egyptians learnt the laws of astrology. But when, at a later time, there came a flood among the Greeks, and the majority of mankind perished by reason of the abundance of rain, it came to pass that all written monuments were also destroyed in the same manner as mankind. And this is the reason why the Egyptians, seizing the favourable occasion, appropriated to themselves the knowledge of astrology, and why, since the Greeks, because of their ignorance, no longer laid any claim to writing, the belief prevailed that the Egyptians were the first men to effect the discovery of the stars. Likewise, the Athenians, although they were the founders of the city in Egypt men call Sais, suffered from the same ignorance because of the flood. And it was because of reasons such as these that many generations later men supposed that Cadmus, the son of Agenor, had been the first to bring the letters from Phoenicia to Greece. And after the time of Cadmus onwards, the Greeks were believed to have kept making new discoveries in the science of writing, since a sort of general ignorance of the facts possessed the Greeks. Okay, so let's unpack this quote a little bit. Now the LSJ tells us that the Heliadae were children of the sun, Helios, and that they were an ancient family of Rhodes. And from the archaeological record we can see that Rhodes has been inhabited since the Neolithic times, with Minoan and Mycenaean settlements taking place later. Now the Heliadae were said to have surpassed all other men in learning, and especially in astrology. And the word being used in the text here is astrologia, which the LSJ tells us means astronomy, a branch of mathematics. We also get an example from Aristotle of how the term is used, astrologia nauticae, with nauticae meaning of or for a ship, seafaring or naval. Number 2 tells us it can be used to describe people who are skilled in seamanship, and number 3 connects it with navigation. Now this is really interesting because we can see how the use of astronomy would be a necessity in order to facilitate successful sea navigation. And that's exactly what Diodorus says about the Heliadae. He says that they introduced many new practices of seamanship and that they also established the division of the day into hours. Now considering the fact that astronomy is considered to be a branch of mathematics, then dividing the day into hours would have required knowledge of the division of the perceived circular motion of the sun. And we do that today with a clock, which is essentially a circle divided into 12 sections. And I just want you to bear that in mind as we continue through this presentation. Now Diodorus goes on to say that one of the Heliadae, Ichthys, sails to Egypt and founds a city there, naming it Heliopolis after his father Helios. And that it was actually from Ichthys that the Egyptians were to learn the laws of astronomy. Now according to Diodorus, during the flood, the Greeks were destroyed along with all their written monuments, a statement which seemingly implies that the Greeks did indeed have a form of writing prior to the flood. Now the text goes on to say that because of these events taking place, quote, the Egyptians appropriated the knowledge of astrology, and that the Greeks in their ignorance no longer laid claim to writing, and the belief prevailed that the Egyptians were the first to effect the discovery of the stars, end quote. Okay, so as you can see, this is yet another account from Diodorus which states that in the pre-flood era, the Greeks did indeed have written monuments. And this comes in addition to the statement that we looked at last week, where Diodorus said the letters which Cadmus brought to the Greeks were not Phoenician in origin, but were in fact Pelasgian. And as we saw, the term Pelasgian was sometimes applied to the Thessalians, and Thessaly was the region in which Deucalion was said to rule prior to the flood. In the Loeb translation of the text which we looked at, we saw there was a note from the editor which also said that letters were indeed found in the palace of Cadmus, however they were not of Semitic origin. So what is going on here? Now this brings me on to a comment from the last video which looked at this supposed Pelasgian origin of the letters. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta, etc. are all meaningless noises. In Hebrew and Phoenician, the letter names have meaning. Aleph equals bull, Beth equals house, etc. Likewise, the earliest forms of the letters look a bit like the name. Aleph was originally upside down A, which looks like a bull's head. Now I'd like to point out that the Greek letters are not all meaningless noises. They are symbolic representations of all of the sounds that the human mouth can make, give or take a few which may be unique to certain languages or regions. Now this means that once somebody knows how to pronounce these sounds as signified by their name, they can be used to render words in other languages. And this is why we see, for example, inscriptions using the Greek, Etruscan and Latin alphabets being used to convey words in the Celtic language. And this leads me on to the final part of the presentation, which may potentially be additional evidence which supports the claim being made here by Diodorus. Now last year, I was playing around with the geometry that can be found within a circle that's been divided into 12 segments. It very quickly became apparent that the Germanic runes as well as the Welsh cauldron could be found within the geometry. So I decided to try Phoenician, Etruscan and Greek, and they all seem to fit the pattern. Let's take a look. Now if the origin of the letters actually lie within sacred geometry, then that would indeed throw a spanner into the works of the theory that the letter A was originally an upside down bull's head. So did the letters come from geometry and mathematics, which was seemingly born of the observations of nature and the movements of the heavenly bodies? Well, after researching further, I stumbled upon two inscriptions which seemingly have a similarly divided circle alongside letters which can be found within the geometry of said divided circle. The first one is the Ichthys symbol, which is carved onto a stone which was found at Ephesus. As you can see, there is a wheel divided into 8 segments as opposed to the 12 I have demonstrated, but as you can see, each letter can be found within the geometry that is within the circle. The next inscription is actually a Gallo-Etruscan inscription recovered from Briona, Italy. And harkening back to my previous comments regarding the Greek letters not being meaningless noises, the Gauls were using Greek, Etruscan and Latin to render their Gaulish languages, and David Sifter from the University of Maynooth has the following to say on the subject. Quote, "At least 3 different writing systems were used to write Gaulish in the course of its history, which are traditionally referred to as Gallo-Etruscan, Gallo-Greek and Gallo-Latin. These names do not imply any linguistic influence of the respective idioms on Gaulish. They merely signify that the Gaulish language was written in an alphabet that is more commonly associated with other languages." End quote. As you can see, we have the same wheels next to the inscription, and each of the letters can be created from the lines which are used to dissect the circle. Obviously, the more divisions of the circle, the more resolution you have to play with when rendering the letters. Now finally, the same wheels can be found in the Oera Linda book, which even though it's commonly thought to be a hoax, I did find it interesting that the same ciphers could be found in the document. Also, as a little added bonus, I just thought I would let you know that you can also find the unicursal hexagram hidden within the geometry of the circle divided into 12. Now, I'm not saying this is definitely the origin of the letters, but it is a compelling observation, which in my opinion warrants further investigation. Thanks again for watching, and to everyone who supports me and this channel. And as always, I'll catch you on the next one. Old Boy, out.